Viewers, today's Converse on Times Now is not driven by some deep and misplaced sense of Hindu victimhood. But we live in a country where a political party, when in power, decided to pass a law that stops communities, all communities, from righting the wrongs of history. Now, I know this is going to pique your interest. What are we talking about? We are talking about the Places of Worship Act 1991, which was passed amidst a walkout by the opposition, or let me be very precise, by the BJP in Parliament almost 40 years ago. That law stands in the way of communities reclaiming their places of worship that were either snatched from them or then destroyed and then built over. It makes an exception in only one case, that of the Ayodhya Ram Janambhoomi case, because fortunately some people had the sense back in the 1800s to already move court. So an ongoing matter could not be covered under the ambit of this particular legislation. According to Hindu groups, this law militates against them the most. And it is obvious to see why, because arguably they have suffered the most under two waves of settler colonization. First, the Islamic invasions that started in 1000 AD and saw the new monarchs defile symbols of Hindu culture, and then, of course, the British from the early 1700s, when there was a further imposition upon our indigenous way of life. The Hindu groups want the law revoked. They want to be able to worship once again at their most revered sites, which are visibly, viewers, built over. And there is no dispute about the antecedents. Now, there are, of course, two ways of doing this, either through Parliament, and given that the NDA, led by the BJP, is in a majority, an overwhelming majority, and prides itself on its Hindutva, this should be easy. The other option is, of course, to go through the courts. Now, viewers, there are, of course, hotheads who will point to other ways, but I don't want to go down that route. We've already been down that route in 1992, and even those that were advocating for the cause of the Ram Janambhoomi were most apologetic about that turmoil that we witnessed. So let's not even talk about that. So the matter is in the Supreme Court. And viewers, it is being heard. In the midst of all this, of course, there's a pushback. The left says that revoking the law will destroy the secular fabric of the country, as it will lead to the reopening of old wounds. And how many temples can you keep reclaiming at the cost of testing the patience of the other community? For now, the NDA seems to have presumably succumbed to this logic, as neither has it brought a law and neither is it taking a clear stand in court. At least 6 days, 6 dates have come and gone, and the centre hasn't made up its mind. It keeps saying, we'll come back to you, we'll come back to you. The court grants another extension. Another hearing takes place, but nothing really comes of it. And as the court sets another date, let's ask whether this law fails the secular test and whether Hindu groups are justified in making a bid to reclaim their places of worship. It is the second question that I want to pose today to two very, very influential and eminent personages. One, of course, being Amish Tripathi, the other is Ashwin Sanghi. Both of them actually need no introduction, because if I were to begin, I won't be able to stop in time and we won't have a discussion. You are so well known to our public. So I want to first begin by asking the second question, because the first lies in the domain of specialists, whether it legally falls foul of this law, that law, the basic features of the constitution, etc. Whether Hindu groups are justified in making a bid to reclaim their places of worship. Let me first begin with Ashwinji. Ashwin, what do you make of this? What do you think?
Rahul, see, as you know, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer this question legally.
Yes.
But what I can tell you is that, to my mind, the problem with Places of Worship Act 91 is that it almost tries to forcibly seal a lid on a can of worms. and we all know that a lack of oxygen in that can will eventually cause the worms to die. And that was the intention of the 1991 Act, to ensure that all pending Hindu grievances were snuffed out. But you know what the problem is? The flip side is that the can will eventually explode because of the buildup of gases inside that can. So legislative and judicial solutions cannot be used as a substitute for issues that demand mutual give and take. According to Sitaram Goel's book, Hindu temples, what happened to them, almost around 40,000. Now, even if we discount that figure to 20,000 or 2,000, but various temples, we can't deny, were destroyed at various times in history. And it is obvious that if we try getting them all back, this country will have severe law and order problems. So, but the question that you have to ask yourself is, forget Somnath, Ayodhya, Kashi, or Mathura. If you are in Delhi, simply visit the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque next to the Qutub Minar. Outside the mosque is a plaque that proudly announces that 27 Hindu and Jain temples were destroyed in order to construct the mosque. So claiming all our temples is not a solution, but neither is denying all of them as per the Places of Worship Act. So in other words, Buddha talked about the middle path. I hope ki humko buddhi mil jaye, that we are able to walk that middle path.
Well, that's very well put. Ashwinji, obviously, this particular law, as Ashwinji is also saying, viewers, is problematic because it really disconnects you. So, Amishji, let me bring you in on this. Mr. Tripathi, let me ask you this question. Look, yes, it does militate in a major way against Hindu rights, though it applies to all communities. And we know the reasons, and I don't think we need to dig up the past that much. But you once told me, and I was struck by this, you were on my show and you said that you used to pray at the Kashi Vishwanath temple. And today you find that a square legislative peg or a policy directive is trying to sort of get into a round hole to build some sort of false sense of communal amity. Now, why do you say this?
Rahul, I would look at this issue from three perspectives. The first is historical injustices, which regrettably have happened actually across the world, and I'll come to that. Second is how you address these historical injustices. And third is, of course, the law itself. I have some views, but I'm certainly not an expert, view on whether the law actually needs to be repealed in the way it's done. But anyway, so the first thing, historical injustices. They happened across the world. I'm living in London right now. Catherine Nixie had written a book on the Christian destruction of the classical world. Pagan temples, what are called pagan cultures, temples, universities, indeed entire civilizations were wiped out in a historical sweep over the last 2,000 years. And there has been an approach to at least speak of those historical injustices truthfully. And there were various, like the slave trade, for example, that was carried out in Europe. It is being spoken of truthfully, because truth is often the best disinfectant. Assuming that nothing happened or being in denial is not the best way to solve it. As Ashwin said rightly, it leads to more poison. So historical injustices did happen across much of the world. The difference is that the Hindu, Jains, and Buddhists have survived. The Greco-Roman pagans, the Pharaonic Egyptians, the Gilgamesh Mesopotamians, the Central Americans, they're all dead. Those cultures are museum pieces. So the second issue that comes up then is how do you address these historical injustices? There are examples in India too, for example. There were historical injustices against the backward castes. And India acknowledged it. And has the largest affirmative action positive discrimination program in the history of humanity to address this historical injustice. So it has been acknowledged and something was done about it. right? Through a legal route. In some countries, regrettably, and even in the West, these historical injustices are being addressed through what I would call illegal routes. There are statues being pulled down in the West, actually, right? Which I am not a supporter of such things, because that leads to more chaos. You can't blame today's communities for what their ancestors may have done. This is wrong. And secondly, if there's any injustice that needs to be addressed, it must be done legally. In the West, by the way, it's not happening, right? Many of these injustices are being addressed illegally through protest, through tearing down statues, etc. In India, at least, I'm happy that if these injustices have to be addressed, they are being addressed legally, right? So, like the Ram Janmabhoomi Ji case ran for more than a century, which is the way to. But you have to address these issues. You can't just assume that they never happened. It will lead to more poison. Then the third thing that comes up is the law itself. I'm not a lawyer, but from what I have read, the way the 1991 Act is written, it does put a pause on status of monuments as of 1947. But there is a clause that heritage monuments are outside of it. And if you see the Heritage Act of 1958, if I'm not mistaken, it says that any monument that is more than 100 years old is by itself, without the government having to declare it a heritage monument. So therefore, does the law even need to be repealed? And from what I know, lawyers such as Vishnu Jain and Sai Deepak are arguing on this very point within the court. So this is perhaps an issue too, that does the act really need to be repealed? And the last thing I learned from a personal basis, you did mention about Kashi. I am from Kashi. And like most of us Kashi people, I'm a very, very proud devotee of Lord Shiva. From a young age, we used to go to Kashi Vishwanath Ji temple. Fortunately now, it's been expanded a lot more and it's a good, clean atmosphere. एक तरह से हमारे बाबा की इज्जत लौटा दी गई है. But earlier we used to go through a very small gully, dirty, and in those days, now you can't go there anymore, but there was a massive Nandi, Lord Nandi, looking at the Gyanvapi mosque, which is where the original temple used to be, waiting patiently for 400 years to see his Lord once again. And I think all of us Hindus who feel very deeply about it, for us, Lord Nandi is our model. We will wait patiently, but we will not forget. And we will not do anything illegal or adharmic. That would be wrong. But across the world, historical injustices are addressed. We must not follow the Western example of doing illegal things. This is India. We answer to a higher purpose. It must be done legally, properly, and there must be no hatred for communities today for what ancestors may have done. And I must point this out. 85-90% of the Muslims today are Pasmanda Muslims, right? The invaders were Turks. If we are very clear that Indian Christians had nothing to do with British colonialists who are foreigners, why are we not as clear that Indian Muslims had nothing to do with Turkic invaders who were foreigners, who used to oppress the Pasmanda Muslims as well? We must be clear on that. There's enough recorded evidence of this. The Delhi Sultans and the Mughals, they were foreigners. Mughals is what we call them. They call themselves Timurids, descendant of Timur. They were Turks. They oppressed the Pasmanda Muslims as well. We must be clear of that. We must not spread hatred today.
Okay, so let me bring back Mr. Sanghi. Mr. Sanghi, now, you talked about give and take, a spirit of give and take. Let's look at that, because I think where Amish Tripathi has left us is at that point. So how do we resolve this issue, if not through repealing laws or, manufacturing a consent, let's say through parliament? So I just want to remind you that in Ayodhya, for example, several rounds of mediation went unanswered. So how does one then evolve an understanding if one side, despite repeated requests, did not yield? Then what makes us think that that's going to happen?
Yeah, no, it's a valid question, Rahul, and I wish I had a very easy answer for that. You and I have spoken in the past about the Ganga Jamuna tehzeeb of this country. But one does need to ask oneself why that particular Ganga Jamuna tradition did not take root in India. Took root in India, but did not take root in, let's say, Pakistan or Bangladesh. And the answer is the intrinsic nature of Hindu pluralism. And that's why probably the founding fathers did not feel the need to incorporate the word secular into our preamble. But then you may ask that why is the Hindu of today asserting his identity? Well, frankly, the Hindu does not have an identity because his worship or lack of worship can take so many forms. The Hindu tends to only assert his identity when the Muslim asserts his. And so, I have always believed that in that sense, Pakistan is not a country, but a notion, almost a concept. And Muslims of India need to get out of that construct. I'm optimistic, honestly speaking. I know this sounds weird, but I'm optimistic that Indian Muslims can lead the way in global Islamic reformation. The reformation of the Christian faith took 1500 years from the time that Christianity came. And today we are 1400 years away from when Islam was created. So this is a ripe moment. You see what is happening in places like Saudi Arabia. So I believe that we are on the cusp of change. The moment that the Indian Muslim sheds the notion of being separate from Hindus or having a DNA link to a bunch of invaders who came from outside, pretty much everything can fall in place. What is really needed is for sensible Muslims to take back matters into their own hands, take a step forward and willingly provide the key places that Hindus consider immensely sacred. Simultaneously, of course, Hindus also need to give up on trying to peel off the scab on every wound. Look at Amish brought up the what is happening around the world, but think about a monument like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It was built as the largest cathedral in the world. Then it became a mosque under the Ottomans. Then it became a secular museum, and today it is back to a mosque, whereas it never started out as a mosque. Or take Angkor Wat in Cambodia. It started out as the largest temple for Vishnu. But then over the years, it eventually became a Buddhist place of worship. And today, it is still primarily a Mahayana Buddhist place. Or you could take the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and so many others. All I'm trying to say is, the truth of the matter is that no rules are ever fair. The golden rule is that he who has the gold makes the rules. And it's foolish to use a hammer to tighten a screw. You need a different tool to achieve that. We are using the wrong tools. I never believe that this matter is going to ever get resolved, either through the judiciary or through the legislature. This needs sitting across the table.
Sitting across the table with
Rahul,
hopefully open-minded. Yeah, of course, please.
Sorry, may I add something, on Hagia Sophia, what Ashwin said, and which is what historical memory is, because Hindus are still alive, so we have historical memory. Yeah. Yes, Hagia Sophia was a church and then became a mosque and then a museum and then a mosque. But what many don't know is that before it was a church, it was a temple to the goddess. It was a pagan temple to the goddess, which was then converted into a church. It's just that there are no Turkic pagans around, so there's no one who remembers. That's right. That's what happened in Turkey. And if I may add one thing of, why I'm such a proud Indian, there's something that all of us who will, of course, go to pray at Ram Janmabhoomi Ji when it opens, we must remember that one of the key archaeologists who helped us, set injustice right was a Muslim archaeologist called K. Muhammad from Kerala. And he honestly recorded, what the findings that he made, which overrode, what were called by the court as fraudulent findings that many historians of the Marxist school put up in court, that there was actually no temple, whereas K. Muhammad was among the archaeologists who proved that actually there was a temple that was destroyed. And to me, that's what makes me proud and hopeful to be an Indian, that we can address these historical issues in a way that will unite rather than divide. We must not learn from the
So
West.
let me ask you. Fair enough. I get this. But Mr. Tripathi, the left says, and there are, of course, historians adjuncted to those political parties or who sort of amplify their message, and there's an ecosystem, and we know that. Now, this ecosystem says that scalping the law will be an act of Hindu supremacism. And I think it was Mr. Sanghi who talked about the worldwide experience. So I want to ask you, because there are other constitutional democracies, some of them may be religious states, but they are so tolerant of other traditions that they have come to become the fount of secularism, regarded as some of the most secular open countries and societies in the world. And let's look at Andalusia, for example, in Spain. Now, these people, the indigenous Spanish people, the Christians there, for example, once the Moorish invasions sort of were pushed back, they were allowed to reclaim. So, you have massive structures there, massive. I mean, they were monumental structures, revamped, refurbed, redesigned to look like, and they're big mosques, and they look like now Christian chapels, or call it what you want. But when we exercise that option here, it is seen as an act of intolerance. How does one square this?
Rahul, there is a difference between what you're referring to as the Spanish Reconquista and India. The Spanish Reconquista was violent, and it led also to the Spanish Inquisition that followed. There was a Goan Inquisition as well, by the way, which many aren't aware of.
Brutal.
Horrific crimes were carried out in Goa against indigenous Hindus and Buddhists. But what Spain did caused actually a lot of chaos, right? And which is why my suggestion is we must not follow the Western paradigm of swinging from one extreme to the other and then back again to this extreme. There is no end to this. Whereas the Indian way is always about ati sarvatra varjait. Extremism of any kind should be avoided, which does not mean that we do not acknowledge historical crimes that happened. We must. But we must address them in a balanced manner. We are the followers of Lord Shiva and Lord Ram. There is a dharma in which and dharma is not is erroneously translated as religion. Dharma is essentially the righteous way to be, the balanced way to be. And if we do it that way, we can actually address historical injustices and not cause chaos. Think about it this way. There are two big historical injustices that need to be addressed. One was what was done on the indigenous faiths by the Turkic and British and Portuguese invaders. And the other was the caste issue. If you think about it, we have addressed the caste issue I'm not saying it has been completely addressed, but where it was 75 years ago, we made massive improvements. And it's been done relatively peacefully. We have, a scheduled tribe president. We have the first full-term backward caste prime minister India has ever had. The predecessor to the scheduled tribe, the first female scheduled tribe president was scheduled caste president. Across the country, we've had powerful chief ministers from backward castes. And so, which means the issues, and there's a Dalit Chamber of Commerce. You must see the commerce that's happening. So I'm not saying there are many improvements to be made, but it cannot be denied that massive improvements have been made over the last 75 years. We've addressed a historical injustice, but in a non-extremist way, in a very Indian way. Can we address the religious injustice as well in an Indian way? Let's not learn from the West or other countries which swing from one extreme to the other.
Fair enough.
Those should not be our role models.
And if it wasn't for our dharmic tradition, perhaps we would have also ventured down that sort of zero-sum game path. I get where you're coming from, and I think that's one of the reasons why Mr. Sanghvi talk about, for example, Bangladesh and Pakistan, where maybe the lack of a philosophical approach accommodationist approach like we have intrinsically here in India through dharma. Perhaps that is one of the reasons why those societies are perpetually in a state of flux. But last question to you, Mr. Sanghi, because it's an important one. Now, look, at the end of the day, willy-nilly, if the matter is before the court, there will be, at some level or the other, some sort of a verdict, maybe not today, maybe in 10 years, whatever. There are many who say that exceptions should also be made now. So, Ayodhya was exempted from the ambit. Let the place of worship act be, but modify it, amend it to the point where you say, okay, 4 or 5 shrines, no more, 4 or 5 temples, no more. Are you happy with that? Or do you believe that, look, that you can't have? You can't have a certain cutoff. You can't say this is more important, that is less important, and therefore.
Yeah. Rahul, frankly, as I mentioned earlier also, it's not an easy solution, but frankly, the solution lies somewhere between the two extremes. And honestly speaking, besides what goes on in the judiciary, I think one thing that is definitely where I feel that the ball is in the court of Indian Muslims of this country is that they need to shed this separate identity and become part of Bharat. I mean, in Indonesia, 87% of the population is Muslim, but the country has not forgotten its Hindu civilizational roots. The 20,000 rupiah note still has Ganeshji prominently on it. In Malaysia, 67% of the population is Muslim, but the Ramayana is still performed in Malay every year. In Thailand, you have 93% Buddhist population, but the king is coronated as King Rama. So the point, and you have a national symbol like the Garuda. So the point I'm making is that Indian Muslims need to evolve and embrace Bharat. Once that happens, and they say we are Bharatiya Muslims, then automatically everything else will fall into place. Remember one thing, and this is probably my parting note, Sanatan Dharma was and continues to be essentially pluralistic, Rahul. Abrahamic ideology from time to time espouses a singular truth in a plural world, that there is only one true God. But this absolutism can no longer work. It might have worked in a different era, but it can't work. You saw what happened with the Zoroastrian culture. You saw what happened with the Mithraic cults. You saw what happened with the Egyptian gods, the Greek gods, and the tribal belief systems of Australia, and so on and so forth. We could be here all day when we start talking about that. The point is that today Hindus have an intrinsic fear that we could be part of those extinct cultures one day. It is the job and the duty of Muslims to lessen those fears. I believe that fundamental change needs to happen where they say, listen, we need to get along. We can't wish away what happened in history, but we need to find a way to progress.
I think, viewers, we should leave it at this. I don't think we could have had a more agreeable and logical discussion, even if we had tried. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for making this possible. Mr. Tripathi and Mr. Sanghi, thank you very much for joining us on Converse. Viewers, we will, of course, look at this story as it evolves in the courts and, of course, in the domain of the executive. Thank you very much.